Complexity Unraveled. It's a podcast production who are grappling with real operations challenges.
Partially because people don't really think about operations as a thing when they're first starting. They just want to figure out how to get that first customer, and they're not thinking about what the process is to do that.
Hello and welcome to Complexity Unraveled. We're glad you stopped by for today's inaugural show. So what is Complexity Unraveled? It's a podcast production highlighting operation leaders across different sized companies and industries who are grappling with real operations challenges, be it value creation, efficiency, scaling, or optimizing what's already working. Our guests have solved and are still tackling operational misalignment due to rapid scaling, poor post-merger integrations, or failure to make strategic operational or technology shifts on time. As we look ahead, we want to empower our listeners to be better prepared for the future. What's done is done, but how do we unravel this complexity in operations going forward? So you might ask, what's in store for you today? We're starting at the beginning, talking about startups, because that is where it all begins in terms of operations. Every company, whether in the billions or millions, started out as a small entity, and a foundation had to be laid to enable customer delivery, scaling, and sustainable profits. Success is the result of operations decisions and actions made over time. And when we see operations break down, it's also because of decisions and actions that were made, maybe not made, or even delayed. So today, we have a really special guest here, Katrina Purcell. Katrina, welcome. I'm very glad to have you on the very first Complexity Unraveled podcast.
Thank you so much.
Folks, I think we'll be able to learn from you today, and they'll be able to pick out one or two things. I think especially some of the listeners and viewers who have smaller businesses and organizations, but I'm going to tell them why you're near and dear to me. So about 2 years ago, I've been an independent consultant for about 7 years, but about 2 years ago, I had gone to take a full-time job and I was rolling off of that. I did one assignment and I came out into the market and I was like, something's different. It just feels a little bit different to me. And then I started to find out about all these fractionals and I was saying, okay, that's a different term. And I joined a fractionals forum. And I think you and I were in one of these Zoom meetings in the afternoon. I can't remember what it was. I don't even remember the topic. I just remember being in the meeting and I looked at your LinkedIn, or I looked at your bio and I said, okay, she does something that, is very similar to what I do. And so you were the very first person that I had a one-on-one call with and said, what is this fractional thing? Where is everything going? So to be speaking to you today is really special because we started together, right? We were all in different places in our journey, but it's good to be able to look a year and a half later and say, hey, what have we been doing? What have we done? What have we learned? What impact are we having?
Yes, I love that. I'm still trying to decide about the definition of the word fractional. Something I go back and forth about. I feel like there's a lot of education you have to do to the market around that word. So we all identified with it, but I think the market is still trying to figure out what it means.
But I think when I think about it, I think the term really started, in the tech world, right? I think it came in during the COVID period. I think it was always there, but it kind of it was amplified during COVID because folks realized that they really were not going to get all the funding that they needed. And things were kind of slow. I don't need a whole person. I need a half, a quarter. And I think we've just kind of applied it quite, if I may say, a little recklessly to everything else called consulting.
I do think that's probably true. A bit recklessly. Yes, I like that term.
Awesome. So now I just want to kind of dig into what you do and the benefit that you can bring to the people who are listening today. So why startups? Why nonprofits? Why smaller companies? I know you've got a range of experience. What brings you there? Is it the need or is it just the passion?
I think it's the fun. It's where I find the fun. And so I think I spent quite a bit of my early career at very large companies, but within small groups within those companies. And so I think when you are in a smaller team, there's a lot more ability to move the needle, right? Things you do can have a really large impact. You're able to pitch an idea and actually see it all the way through to fruition. And for me, that's the fun. I really like being in situations where things are complicated or confusing or maybe not already set in stone. And there's a little bit of wiggle room. There's room to be creative. There's room to design a new process. There's room to improve things. And typically at larger corporations, there's not as much room for that. And so working with startups is just something that I really feel passionate about. I think smaller companies are really going to be the future. I think a lot of these ideas that are coming out deserve to be nurtured and deserve to be grown and deserve to have somebody helping who kind of has been there, done that. And so I worked with a company during COVID that did an IPO, which was a lot of fun. But once it became a public company, I thought, okay, this is boring. It's not, it's quarterly earnings, quarterly this, quarterly that. And it didn't feel as exciting. And so for me, startups are exciting. They're fun. Every day is different. There's pressure, but I like some level of pressure. I spent 12 years of my career doing live news, right? And so that's very pressure filled, right? You have to get that adrenaline rush from somewhere.
Wow.
And so for me, that's startup life.
So I was just about to follow you down that news track, but we're just going to pause that for a second because you said so many interesting things in the last when you were speaking. I think the first thing you said was about startups, right? And I remember because I started out in the IT world and I was working for a large company in their IT department. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I don't want to miss this wonderful startup wave that's happening. And that was the whole point, right? The whole thrust of it was like, I'm going to start up because it's smaller and I'm going to get more responsibility. I'm going to learn more and I'm going to be able to have a greater impact. So I agree with you that yes, that is true. And indeed, it did feel good. And you did get a sense of accomplishment. You were able to do that. And then you also talked about, like working in small teams in large companies. Now, yeah, that's kind of, it's 50-50, right? You can work in a small team in a large company and have a lot of impact. But I think one of the things that I get out of my career right now is being able to be an individual that's having a large impact in a large company. So when I think of doing a global rollout of a quality management system at a biopharma company that goes all around the world to 8,000 users, 39 manufacturing sites, that feels really pretty impactful.
Yep.
Too. So what have you seen in these smaller organizations? Like, what are the trends and what are the mistakes? We said we wanted to start at the beginning. Are people getting it wrong at the start, or is it something that's just kind of evolving over time, or is it when they're scaling? What happens?
I think it's a little bit at the start, partially because people don't really think about operations as a thing when they're first starting. They just want to figure out how to get that first customer, and they're not thinking about what the process is to do that. Or in some cases, they are writing stuff down, but it's not exactly an optimized process, right? And they don't go back to it because they feel like things are changing all the time, so there's no point in documenting it. There's also an element of just making the customer happy, which means that in the early days, you might do things that are not scalable. And that's okay, as long as you know that and you've made that decision going in. But not having someone in the early stage who can really think through those operational challenges, who can help you set things up properly, who can help you understand that you don't need to scale right away, but that you should build things that can scale and be able to kind of have that 36,000 foot view is so important. Sometimes we just tend to march down and we feel like every day is just going to be a fire and I'm going to put out whatever fire comes that day without thinking, okay, how do I prevent this particular fire from happening again in the future? And so unless you've got someone who's kind of thinking through that, you can get yourself into a rabbit hole of constant fires where you actually don't make progress, right? The hamster wheel just keeps spinning. And so I think some founders don't always focus enough in the early days on operations and how key it is to making sure not only do they build a scalable business, but that it's sustainable, right? Because you can have constant customers, but if you're not getting the right customers that actually make you money and your operations are scaling exponentially as you bring on new customers, you can't outsell that. You can't just keep bringing on new customers if your operations are costing you too much.
Let's get practical. You started a company. What should you be thinking about when you think about operations? And let's pretend it's a SaaS technology company.
I was just about to say it really depends on the type of company for sure. So for SaaS companies, I think the number one thing to start thinking about is how am I implementing this? because software as a service implies that you need to have some level of service when you're implementing it. So are your clients able to self-implement? Are you training them? Or do you have a team of people that are going to have to implement this software? And how difficult is it for them? So when you're building software and you think it's solving a customer problem, you have to think about how are you actually going to be implementing it? What team do you need, right? What skill sets do you need to actually go in and implement this at a customer if it requires a pretty heavy lift? Right? So let's think not through freemium, but it's something more substantial. And so I think companies tend to focus very heavily on the sales process, right? They just want to close the deal. They just want to show revenue. They want to show that they're getting money. They want to show customers are coming in. But in reality, that implementation, that service, that level of retention of the customer is actually really important. Almost more so. Yes, they have to come in the door first. That sales process is important. But unless you can keep the customer, unless you're actually implementing them and making money off of them, you're getting more customers in the door doesn't help. And so it really, you have to focus on both of those things. Getting a good sales process, which in the early days should be the CEO.
Let's define what operations actually is in that company, right? Because you were mentioning different things, service, you're talking about implementation, we're talking about selling. So in that world of a startup or tech startup, we'll stay with that example. What would operations look like? How would you define it?
The joy for me is that operations touches everything. And I think some people are becoming wise to this. You'll see sales operations roles now, or marketing operations roles, or, it doesn't have to just be this like side group that's, managing your travel systems and things like that, right? It can actually be and should be an integral part of every piece of the business. It should be in the middle, and it should be helping to make everything more efficient. And so sales ops should be looking at all the systems that your sales team is touching, understanding what the KPIs are that you should be measuring, being able to help you see, is your sales team effective? Are the way that you have the regions defined, is that effective? Is the way that you're slicing your customers, is that effective, right? Every little piece of your business has operations. And unless you really understand and embrace that, you're missing the ability to actually streamline your company, but also make your company more successful.
But I'm a time-starved startup CEO. So I'm hearing you kind of describe almost like a hub and spoke system here, where like operations is the hub, and then it might be touching these other disciplines. So in the ideal model, maybe not ideal, but maybe one of the models for a startup, could it be that you have a central operations group that does multidisciplinary things, or do you just have operations folks in the different areas, or is it a combination of both?
So generally, I've seen it be very successful when it is more centralized. So having a director of ops that you really trust, that is really great and understands enough about each of the other disciplines to be dangerous and can hire someone pretty junior to help them with data crunching and things like that can be really successful, especially in early stages. As your company grows and you start to bring on more large scale customers, you might need more specialized services in certain areas. But really starting out with just either a strong director of ops, potentially a fractional COO, maybe bringing in a full COO if you feel like the time is needed. But I've seen companies be pretty successful with the director of ops. So someone who has enough experience, who's kind of been there and done that, and is able to sort of shepherd along other folks. It doesn't necessarily need to be a full-time role for someone in marketing or a full-time role for someone in sales, but they can help focus on different operational things that are happening.
So let's come to you now. So we've hired Katrina Purcell, LLC. We're tech startup. This is Complexity Unraveled, right? We're trying to simplify everything here. We've hired you. We understand that we need to have operations. We understand that we might not have all the resources we need. And so just say we come to you and we say, hey, okay, Katrina, help us with our operations. Now I know they probably come with more specific problems than that.
They normally just come with like everything's on fire, or we signed this big client and we have no idea what to do, or it's the problem is never specific. It's normally just things feel chaotic and things are hard, or we are running out of runway and we don't know why. And I think where I like to start is understanding where they're trying to go. So sitting down and really saying, what is the two-year goal? What are we trying to accomplish here, right? And then we do an evaluation of where you are currently, right? So what type of customers do you want? Some cases, when you initially started out, you thought it was one type of customer, and then it's shifting, right? Maybe those customers weren't profitable. Maybe it was too much level of service. In some cases, we evaluate different metrics. Now, a lot of companies don't have the metrics we want to evaluate. So the first step is actually figuring out how to get the metrics, whether they are capturing some things that we can use, or just digging into some of the data that they have and then making extrapolations based off of it. So we don't spend a ton of time, trying to implement a whole new data capturing system or things like that to get started. Sometimes that is an end goal, that they need more data, that they need more information. But a lot of times they have data overload, right? They need to know what are the things I need to focus on. And I like to keep it to 3 things. Because anything more than 3 and your brain is going to go haywire and the priorities aren't going to be clear. And so the first thing that we do is really figure out what are the 3 things that really move the needle. What are 3 things that if we either stop them, or if we started them, or if we switched how we were doing them, would actually affect the next 3 months?
So those 3 things, they could be in any area. They could be in operations. They could be in marketing. They could be in sales. They could be in customer success. They could be in product. They could be anywhere.
They could be in anywhere. Yeah. My biggest thing when I interview clients is their willingness and understanding to accept change.
Yes. Now, how do you deal with that? And I know we're almost coming to that point, but how do you deal with that? Because yes, sometimes clients can say they want change. You show up with the change, and then the next morning, especially with small companies, my experience, I don't know if it's been yours, with larger companies, people kind of stay the course, at least they'll think about it for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
But with small companies, my saying sometimes it's kind of like, which side of the bed did they wake up on this morning?
And especially if they're still very founder-led.
Yes. And so when it's a very founder-led organization, you can wake up to any decision any day.
So everyone needs operations. I think that's number 1. Number 2 is that I know that operations isn't as sexy as sales because it doesn't bring in money, right? But increasing your profit margin, right? Increasing your runway by decreasing your expenses is also sexy. I promise. I'm trying to make operations sexy again. So I know that it's a little bit harder of a sell, right? It's more difficult because it's not going to increase your top line, but it is going to increase your profits. And I think that's the most important thing in this current climate as well. You need to stretch your runway, right? You might not get that next round of funding, or it might be a down round. And so you might want to stretch that funding as long as you can stretch it. And in my opinion, operations is where you're going to do that.
Awesome. So how do people find out more about you? I know we talked about you being a podcast host.
Yes.
Could you please provide us with that information?
Yeah. So I host a podcast called the Managed Chaos Podcast because startups are really chaotic. And so if you can manage the chaos. And so we are on YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I have a website. It's just KatrinaPurcell.com. You can find me pretty easily. And I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I've been working on that, although I'm fighting with that LinkedIn algorithm on a daily basis.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has truly been insightful, and I truly want to thank you for being on the inaugural Complexity Unraveled
Congratulations.
Podcast. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening in today. And I am Changa Kamwambi, the Complexity Unraveled host, and also the founder of Kairos, Karois Consulting, LLC. I can also be found on LinkedIn as well. Thank you and have a great day. What is Complexity Unraveled? It's a podcast production who are grappling with real operations challenges.
Partially because people don't really think about operations as a thing when they're first starting. They just want to figure out how to get that first customer, and they're not thinking about what the process is to do that.